Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I am Auron MacIntyre. I'm feeling a lot better, but I'm still a little under the weather, so I won't be on camera again today. Like I said, I think I'm through the worst of it. Probably will be firing on all cylinders by Friday, but gonna keep it this way for now. A lot of people probably saw that Jordan Peterson was talking to David French, and frankly, after the last few guests Jordan Peterson has had, including like having James Lindsay on to attack his fellow hosts at the Daily Wire, we're probably not expecting anything great from seeing David French show up. David French is famously kind of a hick lib. He built himself up as this conservative stalwart, and wrote for years for conservative establishment publications, this kind of thing. But over the last, I don't know, what is it, even a decade at this point, French has just gotten worse and worse and worse, to the point where he famously just got completely trounced by many people. He became a New York Times writer, clearly, basically having sold himself as this never Trumper and even former Republican. Now he said he voted for Kamala Harris in the last election. They talk about that a little bit in this episode. So when we all saw this, it was like, okay, this is going to be a train wreck, because the topic of the discussion was masculinity. Now, I like Jordan Peterson, and I think that there is a version of masculinity that he does represent, but he doesn't exactly hit you as the alpha male guy, right? Like, again, not everybody has to be, but a lot of times, people discussing masculinity, they want to see someone who, been in the military, or done something very physical, something like that. Jordan Peterson is masculine in other ways, but definitely not those. And then David French is just, ironically, I'm having served in the military though as a lawyer, ultimately, uh for a lot of people, is kind of the antithesis, I think, of masculinity in a lot of ways. He's very focused on softening, I think, the male persona in a lot of areas. That said, I expected to walk into this thing and just see a complete disaster, right? Like, a lot of times when you go into this, you're like, okay, this is going to be fun for the audience because they're going to see how terrible this is. There's a little bit of cringe inducing, but then we can also like mine some of the important mistakes made, and we can point out all of the issues. So we have some laughs, but we also discuss something important. And that's, the balance you're often looking for when you kind of do these reviews of discussions, right? When you're commenting on this back and forth, you're trying to show that there is obviously a lot of mistakes made here, but at the same time, at least you can kind of understand where they went wrong, and take something out of it, while also kind of laughing at some of the problems that they had. I have to say, while this was not amazing, there were still a lot of mistakes made, and we'll point out some of those here. It was not the train wreck that I expected. And I think a big part of that was that Jordan Peterson was actually reasonably good here. And I'm surprised about that for a couple of reasons. Peterson has really been harping very hard on kind of the internet crowd, the online right. He's been making a lot of noises about how they offend him, they hurt his feelings, not things that really often make you think extremely masculine behavior many times. Also, Jordan has been very focused on pushing, trying to warn young men away from bad influences. And I actually sympathize that with that part of Jordan's message, but the way he's gone about it is very hectoring. It's very schoolmarmish. It's very, well, frankly, feminine in many ways. And so this has often had the opposite effect. Instead of driving young men away from that stuff, it usually drives them towards that stuff. And so, in a lot of ways, Jordan has been counterproductive in the way that he has approached this. However, in this one, again, he's not perfect. I want to be clear, he's not perfect. However, he does come off a lot more like I would say older. He's older now, but an earlier Jordan Peterson, one in which he was much more assertive and confident about some of these issues. And he really drills down on the men's issues in this, which I think is good. Like, he doesn't shy away. In fact, he really becomes quite angry that people would question that men are having problems, especially young men are having problems. It's a very refreshing thing. Again, that's not completely inconsistent with Jordan Peterson's message through the years, but he has gotten a little cringy on this recently. And so it was nice to see him back. I wouldn't say back up to form, but in doing, much better with this. Now, French was not as great, and as you would imagine, French made a lot of apologies in this, but he wasn't as much of as a disaster as I expected. He did acknowledge the problems that men were facing. He very rarely pushed back, saying that they wouldn't have many of the problems that Jordan Peterson was outlining. And I think a lot of the reasons that French was not as bad as I expected in this is basically at the outset they kind of agree to set aside all the things they disagree on. And maybe that would have been a more interesting conversation. Maybe we would have seen it, or at least it would have been more lolcow, right? We would have had more laughs from that conversation if French had actually expressed all of the ideas that he had, like the blessings of liberty that are Queen Story Hour. But they avoided a lot of that stuff. And so what we got was a conversation that was probably not as hilarious as we might have hoped or as cringe inducing as we might have expected, but was more productive. Now, again, French does make mistakes in here. Unfortunately, he often plods on quite a bit. And so I really couldn't include a ton of David French in these clips because a lot of it is him kind of meandering. Yeah, he makes a point, but he makes it over like 6 or 7 minutes. Very hard to respond to without just playing the whole thing in its entirety for you. This whole video is an hour. I think they did another hour behind a paywall somewhere. Maybe it got much worse there. I don't know. But I obviously have to condense this for us to talk about it inside of my show. So if you'd like to get the whole hour, I can't say I'd recommend it. Most of the times I'm like, I recommend this for context. Make sure you check out the context. I don't know if I would do that to you this time. I mean, I was doing this so you didn't have to, right? Like I was making the sacrifice so that you did not have to go through the painful experience of watching the entire thing. That said, if you would like the context, it is there for you. Again, I don't think I'd suggest it, but you have that option. All right, guys. So we'll dive into this, and we'll just play it from the beginning, and I'll stop in and let you know here when we get to the important parts we're going to pull out.
I want to tell you a story about my son when he was about 13. So I reviewed his report card, and it wasn't stellar, let's say, although it was fine, but it wasn't stellar. And so I asked him about that, and he said, "Well, Dad, I'm doing pretty well. I'm doing really well for a boy."
Right.
And I thought, I'd never heard him say anything like that. And it was certainly nothing that he had picked up at home. And it was quite striking to me because...
So having been a public school teacher, I know exactly what Jordan Peterson is talking about. All the movies we watch and the television we watch, it's a lot of people talking about how women, the expectations are lower, and they're looked down on in a classroom, and they're good job for a lady, these kind of things. But that was just not my experience at all when I was teaching. Women got the bulk of the attention. They got the bulk of the praise. They had the bulk of the assistance, and were often elevated in the classroom. And it was the boys that were seen as problems. In fact, I distinctly remember, I taught both high school and then middle school for a little while. And obviously in middle school, they're younger and they have much less attention span. And especially in middle school, all of the female teachers, and they were mostly female teachers, of course, would openly talk about how they did not want classes with a decent amount of boys. If they could get classes that were disproportionately female, they were very happy with that. And there's a lot of reasons, and we'll go into some of them here in a minute when they talk about the difficulties that the classroom environment provides. But I think it was a huge problem, and that mentality is very toxic. As he said, this is not something that his son picked up at their house. This is not the way that they talk to him. So this is a attitude that is received from the classroom. This is a expectation that he's getting there. Now, Jordan Peterson is going to explain why those expectations have shifted. But the fact that that is the default mentality, that women are going to outperform and should outperform men in a classroom, especially when this has not been the case for basically all of history, tells you something is going on.
For him, that was just matter of fact. And of course, that's a deep rabbit hole, because when your son comes to you and says, I'm doing pretty good for a boy, if you have any sense, the first thing you think is, where the hell did that come from? And right. So seriously, because now that's an implicit presupposition that the boys underperform the girls. That was certainly not a presupposition when I was his age. And it wasn't anything that was appropriate for him, because there's nothing wrong with his mind or his conscientiousness. And so, I've observed that boys the school system is not set up for them in the least. The vast majority of teachers are not only female, but infantilizing female and radically left. Boys' play preferences are denigrated. They're required to sit for hours at a time, which is not in keeping with their nature, especially.
So this is really important, and it's important on a couple different levels. So he's absolutely right that obviously the modern classroom especially is very feminine in its nature. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that female teachers pretty much dominate the profession. Now, that was always true in the younger grades, right? Most people had female teachers when they were in elementary school, sometimes almost exclusively female in elementary school. But as you got older, more and more men were involved in the education process. And by the time you get to something like high school, it's not exactly even, but there were a good amount of male teachers throughout. That has changed quite a bit. You see fewer and fewer male teachers, even at higher levels. So there's and more women are also in leadership roles, which means your administration is also usually predominantly female. There's a female culture throughout. Now, again, in many places, that's not necessarily bad. Certainly in elementary education, you expect that to be the case. And I think rightfully so. Women have a way with younger children. They are more adept at, raising and dealing with younger children. They have instincts towards younger children that men don't have. And there's a reason that a lot of people, even kind of raise an eyebrow at a male teacher below a certain grade level. No one's looking at a male teacher in 11th grade as if they're strange, but they do tend to look at, first grade male teachers as a bit of an oddity. I don't think that's, necessarily correct all the time. I think there are great male elementary teachers, but that dynamic is there for a reason, right? It plays itself out on a regular basis for a reason. So you expect that that's going to change, though, as you move up the grade levels. But less and less, that's the case. More and more, it's a completely female-dominated environment in all these scenarios. He also talks about the way that classes are structured and how it's, a lot of sitting around and not being, not moving. It's a lot of focused attention calmly in class. Now, that there was always a sense that you needed to be sitting down in a classroom at some point, and boys still managed to do okay in school. But the big change, and they do talk about this elsewhere, but I couldn't include it in this particular clip, I don't believe, is that they talk about how they have reduced the number of recesses in a school. And that is actually very important. School used to be more breaks where kids could go outside and explore and play. And that actually matters quite a bit. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that we should be focusing on bettering education, but ironically, it's not always just cramming the most amount of hours in. And this is why I have a problem with like the Vivek Ramaswamy, get rid of all play, get rid of all leisure, spend every moment memorizing words for the spelling bee understanding of education. Because it does yield a particular like Tiger Mom product if that's what you're looking for. However, there are things that that type of education system seriously suppresses. And a lot of it is stuff that I think is critical to people from our culture. A lot of Asian cultures take to this somewhat well, but I mean, Look at something like South Korea, right? South Korea has this incredible grind culture where they're constantly forcing their children to just 12 hours of school and then all the side activities and everything else and go 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 all the time, and they don't have any kids. Their culture is dying, right? So yeah, you produce the most effective widget at like optimizing the financialization of your economy, but your country's not going to exist in 50 years because your birth rate is like zero point 0.6 or something. And so you have this disaster looming, because you have put all of this pressure on kids to constantly learn. So there's like a balance you need to create, especially, and I think it's different for every culture. I think there are some cultures that take to it and some that take to it less. But the Western culture has always been one of hard work, but it's also been one that gave people enough space to consider things, to grow, to explore different alternatives, right? It wasn't just nose to the grindstone 24/7, beat your brains out and then get exhausted every night to fall asleep. You had always this understanding that it was both, you learn, you needed the intellectual, but you also needed the kinetic, you needed activity. And especially as a man, you need to do both. You need to feel physical space while also stimulating your mind. In fact, the actual act of going out and playing is, of course, important to children in general, but is especially important to men who kind of need that mixture of the activities. And so, Jordan is pointing out that them being stuck in a room all day with zero play or reduced to like maybe one session. I mean, even the kindergartners only usually get one section of recess at this point. And so this obsession with like trying to fill every moment with learning instead of understanding that if you actually let especially males go work things out in a physical environment for a little while and then come back in, they're going to be much more productive. This is a mentality that is entirely centered on kind of the way that women learn and less the way that men learn.
Actually, if they're active, in which case they get diagnosed with ADHD and get put on methylphenidate, which suppresses play behavior as one of its primary functions. And then they're told that competitive games are wrong because we should all cooperate, by people who are too stupid to notice that competitive games are cooperative because everybody's playing by the same rules.
So this is actually really important from Jordan as well. So he talks about two things here, right? First, the fact that you are putting a lot of young men, a lot of boys on ADHD drugs who aren't necessarily ADHD. Now, this is not to say that there is no ADHD at all. That's not what I'm saying. But the over diagnosis and especially the over medication is often because young boys do not work well in the classroom environment. And the teachers just want them to shut up and the parents just want to stop getting phone calls home, right? That's a lot of the motivation. The teachers are not going to take the time to rearrange the classroom setting and all the incentives inside the education system in order to better serve boys. It's easier to medicate the boys than it is to adjust the system. And if this sounds familiar, it's because this is a large amount of what our society does, right? If you've got feelings, then the most important thing to do is to shut off the feelings, not address where they come from. If the system is causing you distress, the most important thing is not to address the problems inside the system. The important thing is to medicate you until you shut up about the problems of the system. And so we get this constant desire, especially when it comes to the behavior of men, which is inconvenient for many of their teachers, especially, let's be honest, because the teachers are female. And so you end up in a scenario where a lot of boys are on medication they wouldn't need if the school could adjust the environment for them. Again, this is not to say no one is autistic. This is not to say no one has ADHD, but I think it is fair to say that this is over medicated, and Jordan's making a good point about that. The even more important point that I think he is talking about here, and again, having taught in public school, I identify this right away. Boys want hierarchy, and women want equality. That's it. Like that, women want cooperation and equality. Boys want structure and hierarchy. This is or I should say they both want structure, but boys want competition and hierarchy. Boys need to know where they are in the pecking order. It's actually good for them to compete. It's good for them to win and lose. It is good for their character. It is critical for understanding their place in society. They need to know this about themselves. Women want cooperation, right? This is why women are constantly searching with their social group to ensure that everyone is okay. That's why women tend to be better hosts, better caretakers, better social coordinators, right? Because this is their job. Is everyone okay? Are we all working together? They don't like conflict. Men create the hierarchy, establish the hierarchy, work in competition, right? This is how they work. Neither of these are bad. I want to make it clear. Neither of these are bad. Both of these are necessary. This is not about the gender wars. And they get into this, which I think is important. It's not about the gender wars here. We both need each other. But when you try to mix both genders, both sexes, and you try to force one sex to behave entirely in the manner of the other one, which you tend to do because the system gets uniform, right? When the system's all male, you expect male things. And when the system's all female, you expect all female things. Well, education is mostly dominated by female teachers, mostly dominated by female administrators, mostly, curriculums written by women. It's the counselors are women, the paras are women. Everyone involved is a woman or pretty feminine. And so the whole system skews towards female expectations and applies them to men. And so the presence of men in a classroom who want hierarchy, who want competition, they want definitive winners or losers, that's a problem for women. It's not just a problem, it's a threat. You have to understand that for women, this becomes a threat often. And this is why it's sometimes very difficult to mix gendered spaces. This is why in many situations, there were segregations of the sexes when it came to many things, including education, because not just we can't educate the women or something, though sometimes that was the case, but because importantly, they learn and operate in different modes. And if you try to mix them, then you have to navigate the messy waters of, are we serving the female paradigm? Are we solving the male paradigm? And you end up sacrificing one for the other. However, in the scenario with the mixed education, you got to figure it out, right? And again, I don't think it's entirely one side or the other. I'm not, it's not the male way is the only way and the female way is the only way, but it's very clear that we have been completely dominated by the female way in these shared spaces, right? The default is basically go with the female if it's a mixed space. That's kind of what has become the scenario. And the more female the space has become, especially in education, the more that has become the dominant understanding. And so Jordan is pointing out, I think something very important, that the male presence and the male desire for hierarchy competition is seen as a direct threat to the female environment that has been cultivated inside the educational system.
And then they're told that boys' ambition is pathological and that the patriarchy is, and marriage for that matter, is an oppressive institution. And if they manage to escape from all that, then they're told that the activities of males are destroying the planet. And that's pretty much a comprehensive, comprehensive evil queen pathology as far as I'm concerned. And it's not bloody well. Then you add to that, there's an additional twist too, which we should delve into. It's a universal cultural problem to make.
So Jordan here, before he's going to get into another good point here in a second, but he gets, he points out that ultimately all of these messages, it's not just the way that the classroom addresses young men, but even after they escape, if they make it through all of the negativity inside the classroom, then they're confronted with the idea that their desires to have families and play their traditional roles inside of families is a threat to the system. And by the way, it is, right? Like there's a reason that the system feels this way. It's because men being actual virtuous men is a threat to the system. Okay. That's why they don't want men to be cultivated to be virtuous. They do not want this. The system is threatened by men who are assertive, who are masculine, who are dangerous, but are also simultaneously able to temper that danger and turn it towards the good and aim it at the system if they need to, right? That is a danger to the system. So they do not want this. And so this is why every male behavior is pathologized because male behavior is a threat to the system. Female behavior, if it corrodes entirely, will eventually destroy the system if it's completely unchecked, just like male behavior completely unchecked would destroy a system. But male proper behavior is actually a threat to the system, and female behavior is not. And so that's why there, even if there's not a conscious, like, we have to keep down all the men. There's no conspiracy probably sitting around. I mean, there is a general, hey, we should adopt, female attitudes, or we should promote women more. But there's probably not like an explicit cabal of like, the purpose we are doing this for is to get rid of male behavior. But this is part of like the larger kind of postmodern authoritarian personality type approach. The post-war consensus is terrified of strong men and strong gods, strong emotions. They want to, everything needs to be tamped down, everything needs to be controlled, right? And so the presence of virtuous men is a real danger. And so Jordan Peterson is pointing this out, that the reason that they are attacking everything about men, from hierarchy and competition to patriarchy to marriage, even the basic pursuits of manhood are a danger to the planet, right? Like, there's a reason that this language is always framed this way, because they recognize that men are the threat ultimately.
Adults out of juvenile males. That's why there are initiation rites in so many cultures, and you have to create a responsible man. And the reason for that is that it's a hell of a lot easier to be irresponsible and immature than it is to be responsible and mature. And
for men and women. For men and women, yeah.
Right. Well, the thing about women is, once they have an...
I'm really glad that Peterson pushes back here, because French is trying to pull it to like, well, it's the same for men and women. He's like, no, not really. Like, he gives it's like, for a second, well, maybe, no, actually, no. And he pushes back here.
An infant, that kind of catalyzes the maturity, and maybe their nature has a proclivity to initiate women a little more dramatically than it initiates men. So the fundamental problem that cultures face is how to make men out of boys and how to stop young women from getting pregnant out of wedlock. That's the anthropological evidence. And
so, Peterson just kind of lays this out. There's nothing politically correct about this, but it's of course exactly true, right? Like, the purpose of a society as it is structured throughout most of history is to get men to turn their pursuits to something productive, to initiate them into a meaningful role in their society. And the purpose of society is to keep women from getting themselves pregnant out of wedlock. And the reason is very simple. As he points out, women have this moment, right? You didn't have a child, and now you do. And you cannot abandon this child. I mean, unless you just are really, really without, any feeling about it. Men, whether, no matter how we feel about this, imbalance in the system, men can walk away from a child for the most part. They're going to know that the mother's still going to be there, going to provide in at least the most basic level of subsistence and care. The man can usually not do the same for the child, especially very young. And so children, just at their youngest, need mothers, and they need them immediately. That's, the mother's body is literally, designed to nourish the child. So there's just a very big gulf between the options that men and women have once a child is born. So women are pretty much immediately, kind of baptized by this event. Now, given our culture and the way that we approach motherhood, the fact that birth control and abortion are things that women can't avail themselves of, there's less of that, but it still always exists, right? There's still a certain level of that that's just biologically built in. Now, for men, there was some level of this for most of history, because male strength was necessary to the survival of pretty much every tribe, right? Your civilization and just really just fighting the wilderness, providing day to day, you had to be involved. Men were going to do combat. You may not be an official soldier somewhere, but it was understood that when a violent situation arose, as a male, it was your job to solve the problem, right? That was a very clear role for men throughout the years. Or if a very dangerous situation, someone's got to go out and fight the tiger, somebody's got to go out and hunt something and bring it back. That was the male role, right? Women foraged next to the child to stay close and care for the family and the homestead. Men struck out and put themselves in danger. And so even if you weren't immediately going to war, even as a young man, you were going to run into some situation where you were going to be challenged physically. And so that was some level of biological necessity for the initiation of men into culture that existed alongside with women. Now, so much of that is gone, right? Now, a lot of it is artificially gone. Some of it is due to technology. We don't need the strength, the raw physical strength all the time like we used to. Some of it is because of the growth of the state. We've grown the state so large that people assume that it should resolve every conflict on its own. And so any amount of violence is forbidden as long, depending on what neighborhood you're in and the level of policing. But if you're in the wrong neighborhood and you do some level of violence, it can ruin your entire life. I've had friends who've gotten absurd police charges for getting in a small shoving match in a public place. I mean, don't get me wrong. I would like law and order. I don't want, I don't want a bunch of people just fist fighting everywhere. But there's a certain level of minimal, pushback that was allowed before the cops, came and, threw you in jail. That just doesn't exist anymore. And so a lot of these situations where men were testing themselves and being initiated just naturally, the momentum of the experience would push you towards it. That's not there anymore, but it is still there for a lot of women.
So the boys face I think, a virtual conspiracy of demoralization. And that seems to me to be, that's underneath the political, but the Democrats have been playing that hand madly for, I'd say, 4 generations. And now they're reaping what they sowed.
So a lot of this
So Jordan is saying, look, a lot of this is outside of the political, but it manifests in the political. And that's important. We have, I think, a more symbiotic relationship than Jordan is necessarily addressing right away here. But most of what he's saying is true. A lot of, again, we don't spend enough time, we don't think enough about how technology has changed our relationship of the sexes. We just go directly to the gender wars. Oh, it's all one side or the other who has demanded this. And don't get me wrong, both sides have made the mistakes here. I think women have probably had the better end of that for quite a few decades here. But ultimately, I think both sides have made mistakes in this exchange. But the fact that there is sides at all is a problem. Men and women should not have sides. They should not be in conflict. They should be working together to form families, to form a society. These things are cooperative in a very important sense. You have competition between different groups of men and women, but you should not have competition between men and women writ large. That is a very toxic way to understand your society. And the fact that this has been, as Jordan put out, is basically a conspiracy to undermine men has been very bad. Now, again, I think a lot of it is technology. A lot of it is the fact that technology has changed the nature of the household. It's changed the nature of labor. It's changing the nature of communication. It has changed the nature of dependency. And that is a huge issue. Much of the labor and security and financial and physical well-being that was provided by men, women can now default out and go to the state, right? And it's not seen as being a failing. It used to be, if you were on welfare, that was a problem, right? You had the insult of the welfare queen. It's the woman who just had a bunch of children out of wedlock, and rather than rely on one of their fathers to be a virtuous man and take care of him, she would prefer to just go around to whatever man she was feeling at the moment, and then let the state ultimately be her real husband, right? This has really been the key, is turning the state has acquired enough power and enough technology and enough wealth to be able to stand in for men in many of these situations. It's created enough safety It's created enough prosperity to where women can kind of say, well, I don't think I really need what men used to provide anymore. And so I think that they're ultimately losing in that exchange. I think it's very clear women are very unhappy. Many, children are coming from more and more broken households. We see what fatherlessness does to children. The statistics are extremely clear and very damning that a fatherless child, a child without a male role model in the household, has significant damage done to them. We know all this, but women could ignore those things in the short term because in the long term, because in the short term they were getting their physical needs met, they were getting their security needs met, their prosperity needs met, and so they could kind of ignore that men were being undermined in a dangerous way.
You hear from the extreme left, and you laid out the way there are folks on the extreme left who just comprehensively demolish masculinity. Now, I'd say most boys have not been exposed to that in school. That might be you might see that in some hyper progressive prep schools or whatever, but some degree of that, some element.
So this is just garbage from David here. Sorry, but no, your boys are seeing this in school. They're seeing this very much in school. I know, I was in the schools your boys were in, right? Like, I was in the schools teaching. I saw this all the time. This is everywhere. Now, is it more deranged in a college setting, in some kind of wild left-wing prep school? Yeah, absolutely. Is it present in your school, your kids' school? 100%. And I'm sorry, but I don't care if you live in rural Tennessee or Alabama or something. It's there too. You know why? Because guys like David French are there. Okay. Like the hick libs are there and they are pushing this. Is it less? Would I rather have my kid in a school that is rural and not having as much of these attitudes as one that is like deep in the heart of some progressive suburb and pushing this stuff out? Yes, of course. But is it not there? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And so David is really just equivocating here. Now, he'll point out later that this is going to be everywhere. So even if it's not in your school, then your kid's going to still deal with it. But he is fooling himself if he thinks the average male student is not experiencing this from their earliest years in public schooling.
Of that is coming and leaking through and permeating through a lot of American culture. And one of the things that I have seen is that a lot of the people, when we talk about this, when we raise this issue, a lot of people in the commentary and the commentary class and the academic class immediately denigrate a lot of the evidence about the struggles of young men and boys because they don't see in their milieu, they don't see men struggling because they're in places where it might be, say, elite academia or high-level corporate work or in the military or government where men are still at the tip of the spear, at the apex of kind of American commercial and political and economic achievement. Men are still doing quite well. It's the big, giant number of people who are not in that sort of tip of the spear who are really struggling. And because...
So this is like half a good point by David French. Like he was so close, right? Like he was doing okay for a minute there. So he rightly points out that a lot of the, commentators, the social commentators, the elites inside wider society, not in the conservative sphere, but the wider society, they're in these bubbles where men are still doing relatively well. Like they're in these very high performing professions, and they see a lot of men around them in management positions and leadership positions and CEOs and such. And so they look at them and they say, look, men are doing just fine. I don't know what you're talking about. And then French kind of, after making that good point, turns around and says, and well, men are doing quite well in these areas. Okay, but French doesn't address the basic reasons as to why there are always going to be men in these positions. And this is just, I'm not going to rehash all this because this is so like 2015 YouTube, but this is just the gender pay gap argument all over again, right? Why do you see men disproportionately in leadership positions, even when our entire society is incentivizing women? Women are the majority of people graduating college. They're getting the scholarships. They're getting the preferential hiring. They're getting all kinds of additional benefits. Why is it that men keep showing up in the highest performing professions, the highest pressure positions, the management and leadership functions that are the most pressure? And the answer is, this is how men and women are different. Women, again, because they prefer consensus, don't like competition as much. That doesn't mean there aren't competitive women. Of course there are. But by and large, when we're looking in the aggregate, right, when we're looking at large populations and trying to understand trends, women are going to be less interested in competition and more interested in getting along. This is why corporations love women in the lower to middle class management tiers, right? Because they're very dedicated to the job. They're very dedicated at keeping everybody pacified. They're very vigilant and good at building, cultures where people feel included. But when it comes time to say who's putting in the 85 hours, right? When it comes time to say who's making the high risk, high reward decision, who's willing to do this stuff, it turns out it's usually men. And that's because a lot of reasons. One, men are wired to be more risk reward oriented, more competitive. Two, they're less likely to have to care for children. Even with all of the ways in which women can avoid having children at this point, a lot of women still have kids, and they necessarily have to take time off of their career, even if it's only for a little while, even if it's criminally low, the amount of time they're spending with their kids, it's still an interruption, it's still a distraction from their ability to dedicate them entirely to these positions. Now, again, that makes no difference for the vast majority, the middle that David French is now talking about, right? And he's back to a decent point. In the middle here, in the normal land, that doesn't matter. And women are way outperforming men because of that, all of the advantages they're receiving and all the disadvantages men are receiving in those areas. But men still dominate at the top because they're the ones who are going to put out that level of effort. They're willing to take on that level of risk. They don't have to worry about raising children. They have a number of key features, competitiveness, that are going to reliably place them into these positions. And so, yes, to some extent, you can look in these bubbles and say men are doing well. But if you don't understand why men will do well in those positions, no matter how you structure society, then you can't look at whether or not society is actually having an impact on young men.
So many of us live in these bubbles. A lot of people don't see it at all. They don't see it at all. And this is something that I think is endemic in our commentariat, and that is a lot of our commentariat lives and eats and breathes a very rarefied cultural air, and they don't have any real world sense of the way that people are living their lives and the struggles they're facing outside of that milieu. And so when you walk into and you start talking about how these young men are struggling, a lot of times you get I've been in these rooms where people immediately dismiss you. Well, disproportionate number of men are CEOs, a disproportionate number of men are in Congress, you name it. And I'm like, I'm not talking about the tip of the spear here. I'm talking about millions upon millions of people, regular Americans who are struggling. And in many ways, they're not struggling because of you, but are you helping or are you hurting? And I can tell you right now, if you're telling men that, for example, traditional masculinity ideology is inherently toxic, you're hurting. You're not helping. And
again, right here, this is the best thing French does, right? He's not great throughout this, but he is at least accurate here, right? That you have the scenario where even suggesting that men could have problems is often dismissed out of hand by a lot of people. Oh, but men don't have problems. Men have always run society and will always run society. Men have always had all the privilege and will always have the privilege. It doesn't matter what the actual data says. It doesn't matter if you look at the life expectancy of the average male or the happiness. Like, none of that matters. It doesn't matter if you look at that in the middle there. They're going to school less. They're getting rejected for jobs more often. None of that matters because somewhere there's a male CEO. And so as long as there's more male CEOs than female CEOs or more male generals than female generals, then men are doing just fine. And French points out that mentality is absolutely disastrous.
I tend to have an explanation of the struggles of young men that's rooted in a lot more than ideology and politics. It's rooted in changing economies and changing technologies. A lot of things changed in a way that left men in a position where they would often feel like I'm not as necessary, I'm not as needed as I was. A lot of the raw strength, that raw physical strength, for example, that men have, became less and less important to be a part of a vibrant economy. Military is shrinking. The U.S. military is much smaller right now than it was at the height of the Cold War. A lot of these things created dynamics where men felt less needed. And then you have another part of this cultural world that then...
So French is making a good point here again. I don't know if he's the best person to deliver this point, but the content is the same. Nevertheless, technology has radically shifted society, and it has radically shifted some of the things that men used to do that were absolutely inescapable for society. But very importantly, it's also enabled the state to do many of these things. And so the state has taken over the role that men played. And so women often look at men and say, well, I don't need you anymore because these things are obsolete. But of course, they aren't obsolete. It's not that those functions are unnecessary. It's that the state is doing them for you. And so you've made the state your husband instead of having a husband, which seems like a deal, right? For some women who had terrible husbands, maybe even was a deal. But ultimately, you are tying yourself to an entity that does not care about you. Yes, it can provide these things in the short term, but in the long term, you are just a number on a spreadsheet to these people. They do not care about you. Also, women have some terrible instincts when it comes to whether or not the state should be allowed to do things. So, for instance, women have been the primary drivers in especially the last few decades of sympathetic acceptance of mass immigration, right? Because it is in their nature to want to be compassionate and want to make everything copacetic and work everything out. They don't understand conflict the way men understand conflict. And so if they had husbands who cared about them specifically and their children, they would say, no, of course we are not letting these violent strangers inside our country. And because the woman's dependent on the man for all the things the state was providing, they'd be like, you know what? Maybe I don't understand why you're saying that, but you are in charge of this area of our household, and so I will trust you on that. But when the state is the woman's husband, when it's the state that's providing the security that the man used to provide, and the state is interested in replacing the people in the country for its own political advantage and to drive down labor costs and everything else, the woman doesn't understand. It doesn't click for her because she doesn't have that male aversion to allowing dangerous people into the society in the same way. She doesn't understand that immediate threat because she's not meeting the threat with force. The state does it for her, and the state is incentivized to allow these people in. And so by replacing the man with the state, the woman does not get the same level of protection. It feels like she does immediately, and then she also gets the freedom of not having to worry about what a man thinks, an individual man, or be loyal to that guy or anything. She can do what she wants, but she is losing something. She can't recognize it. She can't put it on a spreadsheet somewhere. She can't feel it immediately, but it will catch up with her. And that's what we're seeing with mass immigration now. There are a lot of women who are slowly but surely looking around and saying, all these strange military-aged men don't seem to play by the rules. They actually don't seem to care. Now, don't get me wrong. There's still a lot of women who are like, I don't care, love the refugees, send them in. But there's a growing number of women who are recognizing me and my children are not safe in this environment. And there's something wrong. But in many ways, it's too late, right? And so that's the danger of replacing either gender. You don't replace either sex. You don't replace men or women, because if you do, the artificial thing will have problems. And the state, as an artificial husband, has a serious flaw.
Jumps on men who are feeling less needed, who are not elitist, who are not tip of the spear or regular everyday folks who are just trying to do their best and are coming in and saying, well, a lot of the things that you feel or a lot of the way that you are is just bad and wrong. And so that created this environment in the sense where I'm struggling and an awful lot of people don't care. And that I feel like is just a giant cultural disaster that unfolded. And now it's not unfolding everywhere the same. That litany of things that you said about what people on the far left think and did, like my son and his peers, they never heard any of that in rural Middle Tennessee. That is not their experience in rural Middle Tennessee. But I will say that all the technological changes and the changes to career and the changes to all these other big cultural changes absolutely impact us everywhere. And so young men are facing a world, even if they're in a very sort of man-friendly part of the country, which rural Tennessee is, they're still walking into an economy and they're still walking into a culture that has been through a lot, generations of upheaval. And in that circumstance, you really have to intentionally lean in to mentor young men into virtuous masculinity.
Now, I think that French is, again, deluding himself in believing that his son and boys in rural, Tennessee or Alabama haven't caught any of this stuff in their lives or in their schools. That's just not the case. It's not as bad there. He probably doesn't notice it as much, but it certainly exists. However, he is correct that when they enter the world at large, no matter how, shielded they were by having a semi-traditional upbringing from the worst of this stuff, it's going to hit them once they get to the job market, when they get to the dating market. They're not going to be able to avoid this. And this is why it's always good. When people say things like homeschool your kids, the solution is to get away from the cities. Those are good instincts. And when they're young, I think that's actually honest. I'm someone, I hate big cities. I don't like living in blue areas. I don't think it's good to put your family through that if you can avoid it. And so in a lot of ways, I think it's decent advice. However, that doesn't work forever. Like, your kid can't live in your small town forever. Usually, unfortunately, they can't date inside the small town forever. They're not going to never have interactions with the wider world. So you do have to care what's going on at a wider level. So even if you have protected your children from this at some level, and you're fine, that doesn't work. You have to protect them early on so they can build up a possible immunity and the strength to push back. But at some point, you got to let the kid go out into the world, right? At some point, you can't protect them anymore. So David French says, well, then we need to be intentional about these rituals. Now, I do think it's important that you do have intentional cultivation of virtue. I think that is true. However, French's argument is basically like all the natural ways in which we initiated men have gone away. And he talks about this more at length, but again, it's a very long discussion, and I just don't have time to play all of it for you. But he goes on about like, well, we have to cultivate these things instead of having them organically. And that's true to some extent, but like, actually, you do need a level of organic interaction to create virtue. Like, virtue is cultivated in social roles, and men need masculine social roles, and they need to be allowed to be men in those roles in order to cultivate the virtue. If you have a society that is inherently toxic to all masculinity and views all, especially traditional masculinity, as something terrible, then there won't be the roles that men need to actualize themselves. Like, men need, in order to be initiated, men need to feel that they mastered something. Men need challenge and responsibility. And when you have a society that is terrified of men who have power, terrified of men who have authority, terrified of men who have hierarchy, the men cannot have cultivated virtue. It would usually occur in their organic roles inside of societies. However, if you don't have any organic roles in society for them and you're just trying to intentionally set up these options, well, it's better than nothing. But if men can't go out after you've like set up these roles for them and then live those roles out in a manly way, then they're never going to cultivate the virtue. The society has to, at the end of the day, elevate men for being virtuous, just as it needs to elevate women who are virtuous. If you can't look at a man who is virtuous in a manly way and honor him, then they won't perform that. They won't go through that ritual. It's not enough to just say, well, we're going to be intentional about it. Again, that's good advice in the macro or in the micro. It's good individual advice for you. Yes, you should be intentional about cultivating virtue for yourself and your family. However, at some point, like we said, they have to plug back into society. And if society is going to beat them down for being virtuous or throw them in jail, look at Daniel Penny, barely avoided going to jail for protecting people as a man. Being a virtuous man almost ruined his life, right? I mean, it did ruin his life. Let's be clear. His life is in many ways ruined, but it almost completely destroyed his life. And you can't look at a man and say, you need to intentionally cultivate virtue and then throw him in jail for being virtuous. That is not going to work long term.
It doesn't happen by osmosis. It doesn't happen by inertia. It happens through intention. And the best people who do this do it. I want you to succeed in the right way. The worst voices are just go get what's yours, young man. That's the toxic message that indulges the worst elements of our nature. The message that says that here, train you up in a way that is much more akin to, the Kipling poem, If, than sort of any kind of like blind ambition or greed or sexual conquest or sexual exploitation. But if you're building people in virtuous masculinity, I think that's the oasis in the desert, whereas that toxic, go get what's yours, sexual prowess, financial accomplishment is the be all end all. That's the mirage. That's the illusion. And that just leads them deeper into the desert.
Well, we should.
So Jordan Peterson's going to push back on him here, and rightly so. Obviously neither of them are looking for the Andrew Tates. That's what they're worried about. They're worried that Andrew Tate will come to define masculinity. And to be fair, I am no fan of Andrew Tate, right? Andrew Tate is a gross pimp, no, he's a Muslim, and no, absolutely not. Not a good person. But the fact that they're constantly afraid of guys like Andrew Tate says something, right? And David French says, well, you got to cultivate this virtuous masculinity, and then guys won't become Andrew Tate. But that is really missing the problem, right? This is always what people do. They're like, oh, what about the reaction? What about the overreaction? What if people overreact? That'll be the bad thing. So if we suppress all the Christians, what if the Christians come back and demand Christian nationalism? If we call white people evil and hate them forever, what if white people start deciding that they want to start fighting for themselves? If we attack men constantly and we insult men constantly, what if men start, standing up for themselves and there's a backlash? It's always about the backlash. It's never about the evil being done to these groups. It's always about, the terrible things that could happen if these groups recognize that they are being treated poorly, right? And that's what David French is doing here. Well, we got to watch out, because if we don't get in there and make virtuous men by telling them how to be men, then they'll turn into Andrew Tates and there'll be a terrible backlash. And that's true, but the problem is you can't fight Andrew Tate. Okay, no, sorry, but no young man is looking at David French and Andrew Tate and saying, you know what? I'm going the David French route. That is a 0% game, right? That is a 0% game. And the reason is really simple. David French is not looking to change the system that attacks young men, that harms young men. His solution is almost entirely get a hold of young men early and teach them to be virtuous. And again, you should teach young men to be virtuous. That is a correct part of the solution. But if you do not fix a system in which men are attacked and denigrated for being men and being virtuous men, then they will go to the Andrew Tates. You have to understand, being virtuous means sacrificing on behalf of others. But if others are not willing to sacrifice then on behalf of you, or they're not willing to honor your sacrifice, then you are just a sucker. You are getting nothing out of that. You are sublimating yourself and receiving nothing in return. And you cannot do that long-term in a society and ask only some portion of the society to do that. You can't have a situation where everything is men need to be virtuous, men need to discipline themselves, men need to do this and that, but women owe them nothing. Society owes them nothing, right? You can't do that. There has to be a give and take. Sacrifice has to be both ways. And if you do not recognize that you are asking everything of the men and nothing of the women, then you will set your men up for failure. You have to have virtuous men and women. Virtuous men have duties to women, and virtuous women have duties to men. They owe them something. If you're just pointing out and saying, well, men, you need to be less like Andrew Tate, and, we're not going to really say anything that women owe you anything for behaving that way, they're going to go act like Andrew Tate. Because guess what? Andrew Tate at least has money and has women. And you can't tell men who are watching women flock to, hyper aggressive guys who are just going out and imposing their will on the world and making money. You can't look at them and be like, oh, well, I see I see you notice that's working for all these other men, and the thing I'm offering you is not working at all, but you need to keep doing what I'm doing just because I said it was virtuous. That's not going to work. You need a society in which virtue is rewarded. Yes, virtue is important. I agree 100% that you should have virtuous masculinity. But virtuous masculinity has to come with rewards. It has to be in a society of virtue where women are also required to deliver on this promise. So the problem with David French here and Jordan Peterson, it will push back on him some on this, which is good, is just like you're only providing a solution where it's all on men. And yes, a lot of responsibility will always be on men, but you're not providing any actual incentive structure for them to do this. You're just telling them, here's all the duties you have to sacrifice yourself and sublimate yourself, but nobody owes you anything. Don't expect anything from women. Don't expect anything from society. We're not giving the same speech to women. It's just for you. And that's not going to win in a world of Andrew Tates.
Talk about that a little bit, I think, from a psychological perspective, because there are real reasons why that more psychopathic end of the so-called manosphere has its attractiveness. So back in 2016, when my objection to
Sorry, I left myself on mute there for a second. So Jordan Peterson acknowledges here, look, there's a reason that you are getting this pushback, right? There, like, and this is good because I don't hear him say a lot of this. He said there's a reason that Andrew Tates are winning. There's a reason that this pushback is existing. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to understand that. And if we avoid that part of the conversation, then we're really doing a disservice to these young men that we're trying to mentor. Because if you're just running around and screaming, don't be Andrew Tate, don't be Andrew Tate, and then you're just offering them a losing strategy that will get them nowhere, then you're just destroying their lives. You need to address the problem, in the micro yourself personally, become virtuous, become worthy. But you also need a macro solution for the fact that society is actively hurting virtuous men. Because if you don't, they're of course going to go to the guy who's at least getting something out of the deal. If the deal is you get nothing and you just have to be virtuous and then you get beat up all day and blamed as the world's problem, then they're not going to go to you. They're going to go to the guy who's at least getting women and money out of the deal.
My liberal government's utter stupidity launched me into the public eye. I told the Senate and the public in general that this conspiracy, so to speak, to weaken men would produce a very toxic and fascist-like backlash. Now,
so again, I'm glad that Jordan pushed back on the general idea that there's just no reason that men are going to like an Andrew Tate. There's no reason there's a backlash. He did say no. There's definitively a reason. There's a reason this works. We should acknowledge that. Unfortunately, he goes right back to this trope of like, but the worst possible thing would be that like there's this fascism, right? Like the men come back and then there's the fascism. Once again, it's not about the evils that are being visited on the people who are actually getting hurt. It's the fact that they might actually recognize that they're being hurt and that they might respond in a way that corrects the problem. And understand, if the problem gets bad enough, then the correction must be severe, right? If you are actually worried about the worst possible outcome, the extremist man, the big fascism, whatever, then the answer is always to take more extreme measures now. The strong man, these people always come into power because the more moderate people did not take significant action. They wanted to hedge their bets. They were worried about the consequences of this. And so they never actually remedied the situation. And I fear that though Jordan and David are both putting forward, at least to some extent, and acknowledging the problems that men face in society, they are not ready to take the requisite action to prevent the exact thing that they're worried about. And because they can't prevent the thing that they're worried about, it will come inevitably, right? They're making it almost inevitable that the very thing they're worried about will manifest itself. because they don't have the courage to truly address the issues now. Again, I think Jordan is doing a better job than David for sure, but neither of them are in a place where they're saying we have to radically reform the way society operates in order to allow men to be masculine and have their virtue acknowledged. I don't think any of them are really ready to take the steps for that.
One of the things that, man, I admire greatly, that psychologist Carl Jung pointed out, was that you can be socialized into a conformist persona. And the way out of that is through the dark side, so to speak, to incorporate elements of the psyche that have been set to the side in the domestication effort. Hyper-domesticated young men are going to find hyper-aggressive young men attractive as role models. And the reason for that is they need that aggression. And the fact that that's attractive is just an indication of how much demoralization has taken place.
Exactly. This is so important. If you are someone who is seriously worried, the Andrew Tates are coming, like if you're that person, the answer is taking the issues that young men are facing seriously and being ready to address them in a pretty radical way. Because as he points out here, if you have just overly domesticated a large percentage of the male population, they are going to look for the most aggressive alternative because they need it, because they have been deprived of all those aspects of their character. You can socially engineer men for a time, right? You can get away with a certain amount of social engineering for a time, but eventually men will feel the inadequacy. They won't be able to articulate it, and they'll be extremely frustrated about it, and they'll channel that aggression in the wrong direction. But the aggression will be real and for a good reason, because they have been robbed of something that is core to their nature. And so because men have not had the opportunity to properly develop and channel and use aggression, it builds up, and that effeminization of the men, that emasculization of the men, eventually comes with a huge backlash, because they will see any level of masculinity, especially a lot of aggression, as the thing they're lacking, and they will be drawn to those people. And, again, I think Jordan is doing a much better job than David at this, but neither of these guys are ultimately probably the guys who will inspire men to understand and master their aggression, right? I think there are guys out there that do that. There are guys who are former Navy SEALs and have mastered combat and confrontation in a very real way and can deliver that in a virtuous manner. But obviously that's not the role either of these guys play, and that's okay. Not every guy needs to be SEAL Team 6. I certainly wasn't. But you need to understand that those guys need to be put front and center, and they need to have real solutions to the overarching problem. If you're just putting kind of the David Frenches of the world in front of men and saying, you need to be virtuous, probably. I'm not gonna change anything about society. We're not gonna reward that in any way. We're still gonna kind of denigrate you and tell you that you have a secondary role, and no one's gonna need to respect you. You're not gonna have a wife that respects you or anything. Don't expect that. Don't be crazy. But you should probably be virtuous. Like that's not selling anyone. Of course they're gonna go to Andrew Tate after that.
Because you can't demoralize young men without devastating young women. I don't know if you know this, but in the West now that more than 50% of women at the age of 30 have no children. It's more than 50%, right? Half of them will never have a child. And so on the one hand, we have the absolute radical pathological demoralization of young men. And then we have the insistence that although all that masculinity is toxic and patriarchal, that's precisely what young women should pursue. And so they pursue that, in some ways displacing young men, but more detrimentally for themselves, squandering their youth on service to the evil corporate world, bizarrely enough, given that it's a leftist trope, and the demolition of not only of their fertility, but the probability of their participation in the long-term partnership of marriage. So I mean, you can hardly imagine a more toxic brew than that. And how we got here is quite the bloody miracle. The neighborhood.
So here, Jordan makes a point that is probably going to be the least popular, with the least socially acceptable, but one that is incredibly important. And I know, I'm not here trying to be like, at the end of the day, women are the real victims. But his point is that ultimately, miserable men make for miserable women. We are not separated from each other. We cannot have men versus women and be an actual civilization. That's not how it works. You'll destroy yourselves. And so pretending that you can address just the problems of women and ignore men or put them to the side and that'll be fine, that's a disaster. You're going to destroy your society. Also, when you do this and you tell women, oh, everything about a man is toxic, everything about patriarchy and masculinity was toxic, but also basically feminism says being feminine is the problem, right? Like feminism is the most anti-feminine thing you can imagine. They hate women's natural behavior. They hate femininity. They want to destroy that, and they want to make women into just bad men. And so his point here is like, okay, so you take these women, you tell them that the men in their lives are ugly and failures and dangerous, and they're the reason for all the bad things in the world. You should just shut them out of society. And now that those men are shut out of society, now go be men. Like, that's all that matters. Go work in a corporation, go get jobs. Don't worry about family. Don't worry about raising kids. Don't worry about all these things that have traditionally given women meaning throughout life. Don't worry about being social coordinators. Don't worry about making your neighborhood better. Don't worry about being the social fabric. Just go out there and be men. And so men are miserable and they're put in a corner. And then women are put out there and said, go be men. And they hate that too, because of course they do. And now they're miserable in their jobs trying to be men, but they're also miserable when they come home because they can't find any men worth being with. Because even if they are okay, even if they are relatively okay with working in a cubicle and being in a job, they still want a man who makes more. They still want a man who provides more. They still want a man who's more successful and has climbed the hierarchy higher than them. They still want a man who can allow them to basically kind of take off their job and raise a kid for a few years and these kind of things. That's how it works for most women in these situations. And so they just become more and more miserable because they've already defined men as the worst thing in the world. And then they've taken on this faux masculinity to live in a world that is foreign to them. And then when they come back from that, even if they've adapted to it and somehow found meaning in it, they can't find a man anyway, because they've basically turned all of them into just completely useless to them, right? Like everything about women is, or everything about men is now just completely insufficient because, well, the woman has her own money and she can set her own destiny. And so she needs a man who's going to make more and provide her more if he's even going to be worth her time. And so what you get is this just deeply dysfunctional behavior where families become impossible to form.
There were a lot of women.
Oh, I should say I jumped here to about the end, to near the end of this review, because it kind of goes together with this point. He's going to talk about what the lack of women being home does to society at large.
Who were still at home in the neighborhoods. And so the neighborhoods were established and known territory because they were regulated by a network of interconnected women. And so when you had your kids outside to play, outside wasn't hostile territory defined by the presence of no one but strangers. It was territory defined by the watchful eye of a loose network of women. And that all disappeared in the 1980s. And it isn't obvious how that can be put back. Like, the question is, why did people start to become fearful of the neighborhood, given that there was no radical increase in the probability that your child was going to be abducted by, some psychopath?
That's a really good question.
Why, yes, it is a really good question. Now, David does not provide a good answer for it. But again, we don't have time to get into every one of his meandering answers. The point is that Jordan Peterson is offering a very good problem, right? Or very good commentary. A lot of people now look and they say, why can't children roam the neighborhood anymore? Why can't children go outside? Why do we feel so unsafe throughout our society? Why is the scenario where women are just not why do we have this issue where we just can't let people go outside and we feel unsafe? And the answer is multifaceted. One of them is, like he says, this lack of network, this lack of women at home. When we took women and we just threw them in the workplace, everyone was like, well, they're not really doing anything at home anyway. And that's just insane. Like, yes, they were raising their children, and that itself is extremely important. But their constant presence in society provided a safety net. There was a level of vigilance and understanding. There was a true community. You walked out the door, and yes, your child was away from your house, but you knew Susie down the street, and you knew Cindy, and you knew Laura, and you knew that as your child traveled from block to block, that there would be a network of women who are staying at home, who are there looking out their window. And if someone randomly grabbed your kid, if someone ran up and was beating up your kid, if something, someone was following your kid, there would be people who knew your kid, knew you, knew that person was a stranger, and would say, no, something is wrong, and would get themselves involved. They would feel like they had the right to involve themselves. But today what we've done is we removed all those women from the workplace, and we put the kids into school as a mandatory daycare, or people hire immigrants to watch their kids. Now, first, that is just insufficient. It is nothing near as good. You can't just replace a mom with some random person from a foreign country who happens to make sure they don't burn their hands on the stove. That is insufficient to actually raise a child. But on top of this, you remove that constant presence, that network, that social mechanism that allows you to feel safe and have your child transverse the neighborhood. Now, what they didn't mention, for obvious reasons, was also that neighborhoods have diversified. And people used to have an understanding. I knew everyone in my neighborhood. I knew all the people down my street. I knew everyone. There wasn't this constant churn of new people coming in, strangers from different societies with different expectations, who I didn't immediately trust, who maybe don't even speak the language, don't have the same morals as me. I know I'm not in a society that is close knit in this set of traditions and moral understandings and language. And so am I going to go out there? Am I going to put my kid out there? What if some man who walks up and doesn't speak English is assaulting my kid? Right? Like, can I communicate with that person? If I try to stop them, will I be considered a racist? And so all of a sudden, it's not even worth going out and trying to interact and protect in your society. And now I don't want my kid out there because, like, if there's a confrontation and I talk back to someone who's the wrong color, I mean, everyone saw what happened to Shiloh Hendricks, right? Now, maybe you don't think that's the right response to that scenario, but the fact that, she pushed back against someone and threw an insult at them when they were the wrong color of skin, her life could be ruined, right? Same thing. Everyone's out there. You look at Daniel Penny. He goes out and he protects society against a man, but because that man is black, Daniel Penny almost goes to jail for being a true virtuous man, right? So you look at the society and you look at the diversity and you say, is it worth putting my kid out there? Is it worth putting myself out there? Am I going to continue to go out into that society and regularly interact with people when at any moment my life could end because I interacted with someone of the wrong color who gets the magical, shield that protects them from any kind of criticism? And so for all of these reasons, we are less and less able to interact, which means we are less and less able to have defined roles, which means we are less and less able to develop virtue, which is exactly the solution that David and Jordan are trying to reach: virtuous masculinity. So, like I said, this discussion is far from perfect. We've obviously picked out many of the problems, but it is not the train wreck that I thought it was. I thought I was going to walk into this thing and it was just going to be on fire. And mostly due to Jordan Peterson, a lot of it was saved. Again, not perfect. There are some assumptions here that are wrong, but this is better than I've seen Jordan in a while. I'm glad that this was not the disaster I thought it was. Again, would I tell you to go watch this? No, but I'm glad some strong points were made, at least in these different moments. All right, guys, let's go to the questions of the people here real quick. Tiny Stupid Demon says, let me get rid of this real quick. Given the hyper accelerating libertarian to NRX pipeline, I'm willing to bet money on some combination of Rogan or Peterson interviewing Yarvin by the end of the year. So for those who don't know, I made the joke that Elon Musk, because he'd moved from the libertarianish phase, and then I'm going to start my own political party phase. He's kind of on this libertarian to neo-reactionary pipeline that we've seen so often. And I was joking, well, it's about like 3 years that he'll probably end up there. And then he was arguing with Nick Land on the internet like last week. And I was like, okay, maybe I should have shortened that timeline quite a bit. And now we got a story today that Elon Musk was consulting Curtis Yarvin about his third party. So who knows? It could very well be the case that Curtis Yarvin will already be, who's already been in the New York Times and Tucker Carlson and such. But yeah, he might even be interviewed on something like Rogan here soon. Flora Henry says, in school, I could not concentrate with pretty girls around, still can't. I mean, we joke about that, but that is a real thing, right? Like once, especially you hit a certain age, obviously the hormones take over. And even, in high school, obviously, famously, you have boys and girls having difficulty controlling themselves. You're just going to be distracted. You're going to, right? This is why we have to have dress codes. This is why we have to have all these issues surrounding male and female interactions. And so there are a lot of good arguments for why sex-specific education works, why it makes more sense. Now, everyone's not going to support that. I understand. But ultimately, I think that, the fact that boys and girls are going to be distracted quite severely by each other after a certain age is a real argument. And it does make sense if your first goal really is the most effective education of children. Boys and girls schools do have serious upsides. Mr. Dash here says, it's tough to watch modern Peterson. He wasn't prepared for fame. He's how a moderately right-wing boomer with a fried brain. His 12 rules aged poorly. Again, I'm somebody who benefited quite a bit from Jordan Peterson's work at a certain time in my life. And so I'm always going to have a soft spot for Jordan Peterson. I still enjoy some of his work, though I will say it has fallen off, I think, quite precipitously. I think that's mainly due to the grind that he's required to do as a content producer. This is a guy who's used to being a university professor and having a lot of time to think and ruminate and develop ideas before he has to produce serious work and content. And now he has to do this constantly. And I think that along with the fame and the social media battles and obviously his drug challenges has unfortunately put him in a place where his work is not as consistent in quality. He still cranks out some gems from time to time, but it certainly is buried under a larger set of work that is not always as impressive. Elijah Timon says, let's flip French's concern around. If disaffected men did not flock to Andrew Tate, their concerns would be safely ignored. Absolutely vile. It's hard to argue with, man. It really is. It's hard to argue with. I don't think Andrew Tate is a role model people should pursue. I think there are serious problems, again, just from the most basic moral standpoint of a guy who's out there pimping people and is a Muslim in theory. Venerating that stuff. I can't endorse any of that. And I just denounce it roundly. That said, there is a point at which people are correct for seeking a radical solution to their problems, right? You want a society that addresses those problems earlier, but there is a point at which you do actually have to, this is the whole Reagan speech, right? Do the conservative quoting a Reagan thing, right? But the time for choosing, should Christ have refused the cross? Should Moses have stayed in Egypt? Should the boys not have protected the homeland in the Revolutionary War? There is a point at which things get to be too much. Now, I really hope we don't get there, and I really hope that we are in a society that can arrest this slide and not turn Andrew Tate masculinity into the default that is necessary to get anywhere. But eventually you will get there. And if you're worried in any way about getting there, but you're not addressing these problems, then I can't take you seriously. Because Andrew Tate is eventually the answer. He's not the answer now, but he will be. and people, I'm worried about, the Franco. Good man, at some point, Franco is the good option because he's better than communism. So I get you. I get there are some extremes that you don't want to go to, but if that is something you are really concerned about, then you better get your stuff together now, and you better be willing to take radical action now, because someone will take radical action later, and it will be much worse than than the stuff you're playing. But that's not the fault of the people who take it, because you let it get there. Like, at some point, the radical action is the solution. So if you want another solution, you better initiate it before we get there. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for coming by. As always, if it's your first time on the channel, please make sure to subscribe, click the bell notifications, all that, so you know when we go live. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And as always, I will talk to you next time.